In 1973, the most photographed woman on the planet simply stopped. There was no farewell tour, no tearful press conference, no carefully staged final bow. Brigitte Bardot finished a film, packed up her life in Paris, and moved permanently to a modest villa on the coast of Saint-Tropez. For the next 50 years, the camera that had chased her since she was a teenager could not reach her again. The world remembered her as an icon of freedom and desire. What it rarely saw was the cost underneath, the depression, the marriages that kept collapsing, the son she struggled to love the way a mother is supposed to, and the quiet exhaustion of being consumed by an image she never fully recognized as herself. Brigitte Bardot was born in Paris on September 28, 1934, into a comfortable, conservative, deeply Catholic household. Her father ran an industrial manufacturing business, and her mother came from a proper bourgeois background that placed enormous value on discipline, appearances, and obedience. It was not a home defined by warmth so much as by expectation. Bardot later described her father as a strict disciplinarian, someone who did not hesitate to punish his daughters physically when he felt the situation called for it. The family lived well, a Paris apartment overlooking the Seine, weekends at her grandparents' country property, summers on the French Riviera in the small fishing village of Saint-Tropez, long before the world had any reason to know its name. She had a younger sister, Mijanu, who would also go on to become an actress, and the two girls were raised to be graceful, quiet, and presentable. Never too loud, never too much. What broke that pattern and gave young Brigitte the first real outlet for the discipline she'd absorbed at home was ballet. At 13, she entered the Conservatoire National Supérieur in Paris to study classical dance seriously. She had the body, the focus, and the work ethic the form demanded. And for a while, dance looked like it might become her entire life. That path changed at 15, when her photograph appeared on the cover of a French fashion magazine in 1949. The picture caught the attention of a young assistant director named Roger Vadim, 6 years her senior, who found a way to meet her and was immediately captivated. Her parents were horrified by the age gap and the intensity of the attraction, and her father responded by announcing she would be sent to England to continue her education. Ticket already purchased. Bardot's reaction revealed something about the emotional intensity that would follow her for the rest of her life. She attempted to take her own life rather than be separated from Vadim. Her parents, badly frightened, relented on one condition: the couple would wait until she turned 18. They did. On December 20th, 1952, Brigitte Bardot married Roger Vadim in Paris. It was the beginning of a marriage that lasted 5 years, and the beginning of a fame that would follow her for the rest of her life. In the early years of that marriage, Bardot took small parts in French films, while she and Vadim built their lives together in the Paris film world. Her presence at the Cannes Film Festival in 1953 caused a stir even before she had a major role to her name. Photographers sensed something the wider industry hadn't caught up to yet. Vadim understood it most clearly of all. For his directorial debut, he wrote a film built entirely around what he saw in her, an unashamed, natural sensuality that owed nothing to performance. Set in Saint-Tropez, And God-Created Woman was released in 1956, with Bardot playing a free-spirited young woman who disturbs the moral order of a small town simply by being herself. The film became an international sensation, commercially successful in Britain, culturally controversial in France, and one of the highest-grossing foreign-language films ever released in the United States. Within a year, Bardot was the highest-paid actress in France. By 1958, she ranked among the top box office draws in North America, an extraordinary feat for an actress working almost entirely in a language most of her audience didn't speak. The fame that followed was overwhelming in a way the world had not yet seen. The paparazzi, a term still relatively new, followed her everywhere with an intensity that reset the norms of celebrity coverage. Photographers rented apartments across from her home. They tailed her car. They camped outside restaurants for hours. The press wrote about her body as though it were public property, largely indifferent to the fact that an actual person existed underneath the image being sold. Bardot later described that period of relentless exposure as something close to being hunted, a comparison she returned to more than once in later interviews. Her marriage to Vadim did not survive the fame that his own film had ignited. She became involved with her co-star Jean-Louis Trintignant during production, and the couple separated in 1956, divorcing the following year. Even as her career reached extraordinary heights, something in her private life was already beginning to fracture, a pattern that would repeat across the next 2 decades. She married for the second time in 1959 to actor Jacques Charrier, her co-star in Babette Goes to War. The relationship was passionate and troubled almost from a start. Charrier struggled visibly under the pressure of being married to the most famous woman in France. Bardot became pregnant almost immediately, and by her own later account, the pregnancy triggered a period of genuine emotional distress. In her 1996 memoir, she wrote with unusual and controversial candor about not feeling ready or emotionally equipped for motherhood, language raw enough that it eventually led to a defamation lawsuit from her son and his father decades later, resulting in a French court ordering her to pay damages. Her son, Nicolas, was born in January 1960, delivered while photographers camped outside her Paris apartment for days, turning what should have been a private moment into another public spectacle. Bardot struggled with early motherhood, and Nicolas was largely raised by his father and paternal grandparents, growing up with a relationship to his mother that remained distant for much of his childhood and adolescence. In September 1960, not long after finishing a demanding film shot during the visible collapse of her marriage to Charrier, Bardot reached a genuine breaking point and made a serious attempt on her own life. She survived, received care, and eventually returned to work, ironically delivering some of the strongest reviews of her career from a film made during the darkest period of her personal life. But the depression that produced that crisis did not resolve. It went quiet and waited, resurfacing again at other points across her adult life. Even as her personal life kept fracturing, the intellectual world began to take her seriously in ways no one anticipated. In 1959, the philosopher and writer Simone de Beauvoir published a lengthy essay analyzing Bardot as a genuinely new figure in French culture, a woman who lived without apology, whose freedom wasn't a performance staged for anyone's approval. De Beauvoir called her a locomotive of women's history, framing the backlash against Bardot's films as, in truth, a backlash against the idea of a woman existing as the subject of her own story rather than an object shaped by everyone else's expectations. It was a serious philosophical argument built around an actress who, by her own account, had never set out to represent anything beyond her own life. Jean-Luc Godard cast her in Contempt in 1963, and the French government later selected her face as the official model for Marianne, the symbolic figure representing the French Republic, an honor personally approved by President Charles de Gaulle. Bardot had become, quite literally, the face of the nation. In the middle of that recognition came her third marriage, to German businessman Gunter Sachs, who courted her with theatrical extravagance, including famously showering her St. Tropez property with roses from a helicopter. They married in Las Vegas in 1966. Like her prior marriages, it was short-lived, ending in divorce by 1969. Sachs later died by suicide in 2011 at the age of 78, leaving a note describing his unwillingness to accept the effects of aging. Bardot, then in her late 70s herself, mourned him. During those same turbulent years, Bardot found an unexpected creative partnership with singer and composer Serge Gainsbourg, one of the most inventive figures in French popular music. Together, they recorded several songs, including Harley Davidson and Comic Strip, both released in 1967, blending wit, sensuality, and genuine musical craft. Their most famous collaboration, a song so frank that Bardot herself hesitated to release her original recording, was eventually re-recorded by Gainsbourg with British singer Jane Birkin and released in 1969, promptly banned by several broadcasters, which only deepened public curiosity. Bardot's original version circulated privately for years before finally being released, becoming one of the most talked-about recordings in French pop history. By 1973, Bardot had appeared in dozens of films, recorded dozens of songs, endured 3 failed marriages, and carried an unresolved depression through nearly all of it. She was 39 years old, and she had reached her limit. Her final film was released that year, and she gave the industry no grand send-off. She simply stopped working, moved permanently to her villa in Saint-Tropez, a property called La Madrigue that she had purchased in 1958 as a retreat, and closed the gate behind her. The decision wasn't only about fatigue with the industry, though that fatigue was real. French cinema had changed dramatically since 1956, and the persona that had once felt revolutionary now felt, to Bardot and to audiences, harder to place. In later interviews, she spoke with striking honesty about what 2 decades of relentless exposure had done to her, describing the constant presence of cameras as something that ate at her almost physically, and comparing her experience to that of a hunted animal. Her depression, never fully resolved, continued to surface periodically. On her 49th birthday in 1983, a decade into her retirement, she again faced a crisis serious enough to require intervention. What followed was a deliberate and, in its own way, radical act of renunciation. Bardot sold her film memorabilia, her costumes, and jewelry given to her over the years, using the proceeds to establish the Brigitte Bardot Foundation for Animal Welfare in 1986. She described the choice plainly. She had given her youth and beauty to men, what remained of her name and platform she intended to give to animals. It became the entire engine of her public life for the next several decades. She traveled to the Canadian Arctic to campaign against the commercial hunting of harp seal pups, and the resulting photographs shifted public opinion across multiple countries. She campaigned against the fur trade, against animal testing, and against practices she considered cruel in food production, using the same instinct for public attention that had made her famous as an actress to now pressure governments and corporations. In 1985, she received the Legion of Honor, France's highest civilian distinction. Her 4th marriage, to businessman Bernard Diormel in 1992, proved to be her longest and most stable, but it also coincided with a period in which her public statements drifted into territory that drew serious legal consequences. Her opposition to certain religious slaughter practices, originally framed as part of her animal welfare activism, escalated into public comments about Muslim communities and immigration that French courts repeatedly found crossed into incitement of racial hatred. She was fined on multiple occasions and did not walk back her positions. A book she published in 2003 deepened the controversy further. In 2018, amid the global #MeToo movement, she gave an interview dismissing the campaign as hypocritical, drawing sharp criticism from a younger generation of French actresses who had grown up regarding her as a symbol of liberation. The contrast between the woman de Beauvoir had described in 1959 and the positions Bardot publicly defended in her later decades never resolved into anything simple, and it left her legacy permanently complicated, genuinely important to the causes she championed, and genuinely damaging in the positions she refused to abandon. Through all of it, La Madrigue remained her world. What had once hosted glamorous parties filled with the era's biggest stars slowly became a quiet sanctuary for rescued dogs, cats, horses, and donkeys, tended by a woman who was, by her own account, largely inaccessible to the press that had once followed her every move. Her 4th marriage endured longer than her previous 3 combined, and by the account of people close to her, it was a genuine, steady partnership rather than the kind of intense, short-lived passion that had defined her earlier relationships. Her husband also encouraged a slow, difficult repair of her relationship with her son Nicholas, a process complicated for years by the memoir controversy and lawsuit, but one that gradually softened with time. In a 2007 interview marking her 73rd birthday, Bardot said her past fame meant nothing to her set against the suffering of an animal that had no way to advocate for itself, describing her earlier life almost as though it had happened to someone else. She spent her final years largely out of public view, dealing with declining health that included respiratory difficulties after decades of heavy smoking. She was hospitalized in the weeks before her death in December 2025, choosing to return home to La Madrigue, where she wanted to be. She died there on December 28, 2025, at the age of 91, with her husband present. Her foundation announced her death in a statement describing her as a woman who had chosen to abandon a celebrated career to dedicate her life to animal welfare. Tributes followed from across the French political spectrum, from the film world, and from animal rights organizations around the globe. with France's president calling her a legend who had embodied a life of freedom. Brigitte Bardot was never any single, simple version of herself. She was the actress who reshaped what European cinema was permitted to say and show. She was the woman Simone de Beauvoir held up as the most liberated figure in post-war France, whose face was chosen to represent the Republic itself. She was a person who lived through repeated, depressive crises, 3 marriages that ended, and a relationship with her son that took decades to partially rebuild. She was a controversial public figure whose later political statements drew genuine legal consequences and lasting criticism. And she was, for the last 50 years of her life, a woman in work clothes, tending to rescued animals on a stretch of coastline she had helped make famous, and then quietly disappeared inside of. What she consistently refused to be, from the moment she walked away in 1973 until the end, was whatever the world wanted her to remain, endlessly available, endlessly photographed, endlessly the same fixed image. At 39, she looked at everything that fame was offering her and decided, with the clarity that comes only from real exhaustion, that it wasn't enough. She sold what connected her to that old life and gave the proceeds to something she decided mattered more. The world read her retreat as sadness, and much of what drove her there certainly was. But underneath it was also something closer to a decision. A woman who had spent 2 decades being defined by everyone else's desires finally choosing, for the 50 years that remained, to belong only to herself.